went to Kingsmith or Adam. Unfortunately, my writing partner, Rita, could not be here, so you are stuck with me. Rita is more charming, but I can talk faster. So I'm going to talk about evolving activist approaches to climate change. A lot of this framing through a sort of like critical economy perspective, trying to look at emotions, the effect of anxiety, sort of psychology on mental health, and talk about different kinds of strategies. So I'm just going to jump right in. So obviously this conference in general, right, is framed around this shift a lot in the climate space, that narratives of despair and kind of anxiety and doom aren't really doing much to mobilize people, to get people excited about the climate crisis. So this fear-based messaging is leading to this tension around paralysis and engagement. And so we're going to talk about some groups. I'm going to talk about some groups that, for example, Extinction Rebellion and some others that use different kinds of framing. But I think to get started, I just want to talk about this psychological model. So when we talk about psychological impacts of climate narratives, one of the main things that I want to highlight here is this tool used by this group called the Liberation Health Modeling Group. So this is a group of social workers outside of Boston, and they have this idea of like framing the crisis or the problem that you're having in the center of a triangle, okay? And then the 3 points of the triangle are sort of personal, cultural, and institutional factors. Okay, and the point of the triangle is to tell a story that actually decenters you a little bit. Maybe this isn't just about us, right? In my research, when I look at anxiety, when 80–90% of my students are anxious, clearly the issue is not that 90% of my students have faulty coping mechanisms. Clearly the issue is the way that we've structured the society and their experiences is engendering anxiety. Okay, so the point of a triangle like this is sort of decenter or situate kind of your experience in these larger processes. And so I'm going to give some examples of groups I think that sort of do this, some explicitly, some implicitly in their kind of climate organizing. But first, I just want to talk about the kind of nature of emotional engagement in activism, right? Emotional engagement is a very powerful tool, connects people on like a personal level. Rita has a really great personal story that it would be great if she was here to give it to you, about how she was a medical doctor and feeling kind of unsatisfied with her ability to make interventions into the state of people's mental health around the climate, and started getting into activism. And now Rita's doing a PhD in kind of climate justice and activism and applying a lot of that kind of medical background to these larger issues. But the main framing in a lot of our work is really looking at the core way emotion is key to all of this. And again, the fact that if we're all feeling climate anxiety, right, that can be a source of despair, but it can also be a shared vector of hopefulness, because we can talk about how we experience it differently based on our different kinds of material conditions, intersectional vectors, race, gender, class, right? We can also talk about how it's a shared experience at the same time, okay? And so the goal here, I think in a lot of ways, and this has come up a lot from different folks, is this tension about how we frame the future, right? I think the tension for a lot of eco-anxiety, climate anxiety, especially with the younger folks, is they have a sense that the future is going to be worse than the present and the past, right? And if you look at the numbers, again, I'm a political economist, like, you know, standard of living is going down, life expectancies are evening out. Like, if you look at the numbers, this is the first generation in like 4 generations that's statistically not going to have as good of a quality of life as the previous generation, right? And I feel like implicitly there's an understanding of this in a lot of young folks, but also explicitly as well. So the focus here is how do we sort of recast and reframe the future through this framework of hope? And I have some examples here, but I'll get into those a bit later on, right? So a lot of this tension, right, is that climate anxiety doesn't really exist in a vacuum. It's intertwined with these broader feelings of disempowerment, especially in the context of kind of neoliberalism or financialization or the C word, capitalism, right? In this larger context. A simple example that I often use in my classes is, let's look at the view of a rich neighborhood versus a poor neighborhood, right? When you see a rich neighborhood, they have lots of tree cover, lots of parks. You're using the natural world to make the experience of walking in this neighborhood more enjoyable, right? And when you look at lower income neighborhoods, they're just giant parking lots, essentially. They're warmer, they're more uncomfortable, they're harder to navigate. So there's these tensions, right? And how climate anxiety is sort of embedded in the infrastructure in this larger context. And I think one of the core things here that we both talk a lot about in our work is this tension about empowerment and disempowerment. Again, we live in this neoliberal moment where most of the narratives are about personal empowerment. You can be what you want to be. You can have the job you want to have. You can dream, dream, dream. These are new narratives that have really only been around since the 50s, 60s, 70s, okay? So these narratives that you can be whatever you want are existing alongside the material reality that it seems like things are getting worse. And it's this empowerment and disempowerment matrix together that is what I think is generative of a lot of this kind of anxiety that we're feeling in the 2010s, 2020s, so on and so forth, right? The narrative is that it's kind of better, but the lived experience is that it's not. And I think actually if the narrative was that it's not, you wouldn't see this like discombobulation, this tension around anxiety. And so a lot of this obviously is looking at something like storytelling as a tool. I was talking to some folks over the lunch break, and I have a couple of colleagues who do a lot of work like working with scientists, learning how to tell better stories, right? Because a lot of scientists have really great research, but they can't talk about it in a way, at least in their articles. If you ask them a question, often it's an excellent explanation, but then you read the article and you're like, what is this? Like, got to get through 5 pages before I even like can kind of get a sense of what's going on here, right? So storytelling is obviously a good tool. And a lot of that, I think, obviously is because it can bring us into it, but I think also because it can kind of like decenter the individual until we can tell collective stories, shared narratives. And I think one of the best examples of this is some of the work that Rita's been doing with the Extinction Rebellion, right? And so again, a lot of what they do is they really draw on a lot of popular cultural narratives, even around like heroes, around villains, around love, around despair, to tell stories. Right, so a lot of the framing they use are things around talking about everyday heroes, right? Talking about different kinds of villains, a call to adventure, creating a better world, different kinds of challenges, okay? Mentors, allies, right? And they use interesting visuals to accompany these different kinds of framings, right? Lots of slogans, some of which are sort of negative, but largely you actually find that most of their narratives are either kind of positive or value neutral, right? Like tell the truth. It's not really kind of a doom and gloom narrative, right? So the point is just that like groups like this, what they're trying to do is frame it in a compelling way in the language that a lot of people are using, right? And so again, the focus here is on framing people as heroes, crossing the threshold, creating allies, right? Giving challenges. They're using a lot of the things that, you know, people even in the tech sector would use to drive impact. Okay, you're using things like gamification, using things like good branding, good marketing, okay? Like things that you wouldn't necessarily always associate with like a progressive climate movement, okay? And so we'll talk a bit about the different kind of schemas of in a second before I even go into it. I guess one other thing that I want to just highlight in this work is we've been looking a lot, as I talked about before, of how do you kind of work with scientists to tell compelling stories in their work? Because again, most of the scientists I've spoken to, if you ask them about their work, they can explain it in a really compelling, interesting way. The problem is like the literature is not designed that way. There's this barrier to entry, right? That space and those narratives aren't really for the average person. So when trying to map all these disparate tensions in the climate space, basically in this chapter that Rita and I did, we came up with this matrix. And so I'm just gonna actually dwell on this matrix for a bit. We can talk a bit about it. So we sort of break down the levels of intervention between sort of insiders, outsiders, and beyonders, okay? And so when we talk about insiders, right, these are people working within different kinds of institutions, workplaces, in government, right, utilizing soft power, participatory engagement, sort of drive cooperation, right, incrementalism. And again, I used to be a critic of incrementalism until I looked at all the things that have been incrementally taken away from us over the past 30 years to realize it's actually quite a useful and successful strategy. So I'm not going to dunk on incrementalism. So I think the tension here that we're trying to draw out, right, is we have this sort of insiders and kind of conventional climate activists doing things like lobbying, okay, lots of different examples. And then we have the outsiders, right? This is sort of the more vector of political resistance. So this might be groups like doing civil disobedience, protests, right? The goal is to shift the Overton window, which is just, again, people probably know this term, the frame of like acceptable speech in a different kind of social context. Right? So for example, like we use the word fascism a lot more than we did maybe 20 years ago because of various political tensions that sort of shifted the Overton window, right? And the final group that we look at is beyonders. And beyonders, it's about like imagining different ways of reconceptualizing the problem, right? So things like degrowth, like groups invested in this kind of thing, right? A fundamental thing that we talk a lot about in the political economy of climate space is just that like the math doesn't add up. We have an economic system that is predicated on infinite growth, and we have a planet that is finite. And those two things just don't fit together, right? And so obviously, as long as we have a system that defines health and well-being as positive GDP growth, right? Like we're going to keep coming up against these problems. This isn't to say that like to make the environment better, we need to overthrow capitalism tomorrow. I'm thinking a lot about the talk that we saw yesterday, about like how do we simultaneously sort of reduce things and make them less complicated while still appreciating the nuance and complexity at the same time. So that's why I think when we take like a kind of a political economy approach and look at some of the key assumptions that we make in like how we build better societies, right? We can see, I like to think of it maybe as like a house metaphor, right? The foundation of the house of this society is infinite growth. And no matter how nice we make the windows and they're eco-friendly and it doesn't matter because the foundation makes this assumption that our society is unhealthy unless the economy is growing, right? And that's just kind of an implicit knowledge that most people kind of assume. Obviously, I'm sure a lot of people in this room interrogate these tensions, but I think like as a society, right? This is just sort of given knowledge. So the key point that we try and make in the chapter is that all three of these different groups need to be sort of acting in unison, not necessarily always together as a collaboratory thing, but just the fact that there are sort of different roles and tensions, right? And that you kind of need all the different approaches to move it. Just getting towards the last little bit of the talk. So a lot of what we look at in the chapter is looking at grassroots initiatives, obviously as kind of the backbone of the climate challenge. But again, always like looking at it in this tension of we sort of need these three different pieces. You need the outsiders, you need the beyonders, and you need the sort of insiders, right? And it's really not about framing one is better or the other. It's just like there are different processes and no one should kind of have to be trying to do all different things. So, you know, there's a lot of different challenges that activists face when framing discourses. I think an example of something, again, like the Extinction Rebellion shows some of the lessons that like temporary media framing around things like, you know, the moment of despair ends, tactics begin, life or death, right? These things can have a positive element that can be effective in the short term, but they can also lead to this big tension that we see a lot, which is like climate escapism, right? When I talk to my students a lot, like undergrad students, about like what we should do about the climate crisis, a lot of them sort of half jokingly like, I'm just gonna move to the woods. I'm gonna cabin, gonna like learn how to do irrigation, and I'm just gonna get away from this. Right. And I think the tension, right, is that like, we all know this is a global problem and there's really kind of no way to escape it. And often when you look at sort of maps around like climate and where the climate is going to get worse, right, we can also just map it along to what are the most wealthy places in the world, right? Like all the green zones, you know, are least at risk and have highest GDP and are the most wealthy countries, right? So the tension here is always like the people who aren't really responsible for a lot of this crisis are going to be bearing the brunt of a lot of this crisis. And this idea that you can kind of leave or go, it's A, like you can't really escape it. And B, a lot of people don't have the option of doing that, right? Again, I have lots of friends in the States who were saying, oh, when Trump wins and gets elected, I'm going to move to Canada. And it's like a lot of the people who would be most affected by Trump's policies can't afford to move somewhere else like that. Right, so there's these tensions about how these things sort of play out. So I think one of the main things, and it ties nicely to the last presentation, we talk a lot in our work about the need to build infrastructures of love. Because again, infrastructures are really, really important. And so what we kind of envision when we talk about these infrastructures of love is this kind of coupling of the sort of beyonders, the insiders, and the outsiders working together. And I think the infrastructure metaphor is an important one because it does highlight like how emotions are tangible and concrete. And even if they're sort of ephemeral, right? We've all had that experience of like walking into a room and you can tell what the vibe is almost automatically by the way people are standing and moving, and you're going to be affected by those things. Those are concrete, tangible, material things, right? So I guess just to sum it up and leave some room for talk, because again, I told you I was going to be quick. We have sort of 10 lessons for activism that we summarize in our chapter and in the project. And I'll just quickly sort of summarize each one. And then I actually want to leave the last bit for discussion or catch us up on time or whatever. So again, the things that we've highlighted here, number one, feelings or avenues for individual empowerment can be quite disempowering in the long term, particularly when there's a feeling of the loss of control. So a lot of the things that we talk about in our research, right, is the effective dimension of activism in the sense that it gives you back a bit of that sense of control, even if you're not necessarily achieving the outcomes and the aims that you want to achieve, right? The fact of mobilizing with your community and trying to do something to alter your situation can give people a lot of a sense of agency and empowerment, even if they don't always achieve those goals, right? That can often be sort of secondary. right? The second is the future has been foreclosed and must be recast and reanimated, right? People talk a lot over the last few days about imaginaries, imagination, right? I think it's a really, really important concept, so I won't go on about it. But I think the key point is just, right, like when young people think about the future, what do they imagine, right? And I think we can all agree that a lot of the times they're imagining like pretty bad stuff, right? And so the question is like kind of how do we manifest a different way of looking at that? Okay, another thing is that climate risks, fears, anxieties, mental health, individual alienation, these are interconnected problems that require interconnected responses. Okay, another is that there is no escaping into the woods, right? This disaster is ubiquitous and it touches all of us in very, very deep ways. So we kind of have to confront the problem together. Okay, activism number 5 can be a tool to process insecurity and difficult information that flows from disempowerment by giving back that sense of control. Number 6, not everyone can know, be, and do everything in activist movements. This is a really important point, right? That's why you need different groups, why you need beyonders, insiders, outsiders, because no one can solve all these. These are complex, multifaceted, multidisciplinary problems, right? Which is why a conference like this is so great, because it's organized around the problem, not a discipline, which is, I think, a really, really important aspect, right? So we need shared symbols and sites to organize around, especially with the loss of the conventional workplace, which strengthen our connection to geographically bounded spaces and communities, okay? And then again, importantly, activism often has lofty aims and ambitions, but these can be less important than the process itself, right? Cohering around activated and engaged communities that are fighting for long-term justice and power is more important than that quick win. Finally, number 9, or 2 more, different activist toolkits need to be developed to respond to shifting material contexts. And then 10, sort of the point is to build these robust infrastructures of love that can help us build this more sort of progressive ecological future. And then I think last bit, right, just to kind of summarize some of the core things that I talked about. So the evolution from fear-based to hope-driven narratives in climate activism is essential, right, for fostering public engagement. We need this kind of engagement, collaboration with scientists, grassroots efforts, and a kind of focus on addressing the gaps. And again, this framing, don't love Banksy, but I think it is an interesting poster they did during the Extinction Rebellion. Again, it's from this moment, despair ends and tactics begin. So I think it's just this question of focusing on action, even though not necessarily always expecting that action to achieve these grand, lofty outcomes. But I do think the fact of doing something can be super generative. And so I think I'll just leave it there. Any questions? Yes.
I'm interested in the literalism or lack thereof of the going to the woods thing. I mean, do you get the sense that they are being quite literal about that? Like, do they have woods in mind?
Yeah,
or...
yeah, it's not facetious because I'm like, really? And they're like, yeah, I'd go to this woods. I would order this shack from like, you know, the internet, and I would build it, prefab housing, and then I would dig this well. They have it like quite worked out as like a strategy. Yeah. And so it is interesting. I think it speaks to like, again, a deep level of despair, because often these are the same students who like, I can't get to look away from their technology for like 2 seconds. And so it's just like, that stuff won't be there where you're going. And they're like, so it's these tensions, right? It's this fantasy. And so it's like, okay, fantasies are good sometimes. Let's have a different one then. Can we have a different way of fantastically thinking about this issue instead? But yeah, it is like alarmingly literal, I find, yeah. Yeah.
Nice talk. I think this is implicit in your efforts here and what you're telling us about today, and that's great. But I'll ask you just directly. Inclusivity, is that a word that you use a lot, and concept that you bring in? Because to feel comfortable and actively take part in activism, one has to feel included regardless of the language or socioeconomic status.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really important framing. And again, like a lot of my work is particularly kind of focused on anxiety and the problem of anxiety. And again, trying to like, how can we reframe the ubiquitous nature of this in a way that can kind of make us all feel connected, but at the same time, not flatten like the nuances and the differences. The fact that, let's say, like kids from working class families have higher rates of anxiety than middle class ones or something like that. And so kind of integrating that, like the nuance while also creating a sense of inclusiveness, I think is sometimes a challenge, but I think it's these shared symbols and experiences like anxiety can be something useful that kind of flips it like that. It's one of those things that like, it's very sinister because its logic makes you feel like you're the only one who has it, and then everyone has that, but then that means everyone's sort of going through it. And So thank you for your question. Yeah, go ahead.
You mentioned a couple times collaboration with scientists, and so that seems to be pretty foregrounded for you. Can you talk a little bit more about why that is?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's important to like I think it's important to make an appeal to the emotional elements of this and like invoke that, but I think it's also important, like the data is right there to sort of back it up. And I think that we live in a society that's like kind of dataism, and we like fetishize data, and we think that if we can just get enough information about something, we will finally understand it. But at the same time, I think like there's a lot of really interesting stories that scientists will tell about climate change if you just kind of talk to them about it. But I find that a lot of that doesn't actually translate into the published outputs of the work. And so just getting them to like, they're already trying to narrativize it by just like, what are your experiences like with climate change? And then they'll tell you like a wonderful story. And it's like, I wish that was the introduction to this paper, you know? And so I think it's also just like, it's not necessarily even relying on scientists to bolster the data, but like bringing scientists into this art of collective storytelling to talk more about it in that sense. So I think
As humans.
exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, from you and then you, yeah, go ahead.
So maybe part of that is also citizen science, right? Not just getting scientists to reframe messages, but getting citizens to think or act as scientists would in the discovery, right?
Yeah.
I'm interested in your framework, or I don't get a framework in this in terms of, like, because I did my PhD looking at movements in Asia, environmental movements in comparatively between Hong Kong, Singapore, and Taipei. And so I'm very interested, I mean, fascinating presentation. I get a lot of detail here, but maybe I know you're trying to summarize it, it's co-authored, so there's probably something that I'm missing. But what I'm wondering is, like, there's quite a few questions I have, but I'll try to encapsulate it in one or two. First of all, like, we're talking about Extinction Rebellion, right? It's kind of a global entity, right? And so one of the things that was changing when I was studying movements, and this is quite a while ago, it's over a decade ago now, in East Asia, was the move to use of ICTs, information communication technologies, right? So it changed the very nature of environmentalism. A lot of those groups were older groups that were adopting new technologies, so it was changing the movements, or the movement reconfigured because younger generation weren't using those tools, right? And so I'm wondering about that. Like, did you see something like that where, oh, you guys aren't cool because you're not using this tool, right? You know, in effect, they're all being appropriated because the analytics are being controlled by corporate media, right? You did imply that with some of the way they're messaging themselves, like the way they're sending their messages, and then you also there was some hints about localism, like local movements versus global, and then, you know, indigenous movements. And I was kind of alluded to with the question over there, like, so yeah, what kind of framework? I don't get that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's a tough question, I'll admit. But what I guess I will say is, like, obviously we see a lot of, like, in this kind of framework that we're trying to flesh out, definitely like interplay of like technology and communication. I mean, like, I think one of the tensions, and I think we even all experienced it before, we saw that beautiful video that was played by the plenary, and then we got an ad like instantly, like right after, for like vacation, right? So the algorithm is being like, oh, you're watching this like video about climate change, clearly you're not doing great, you should probably take vacation, right? It's just like, there's just like, it's just instantly, like the critique is just right after, like, so it almost feels like it's like a shadow that you're trying to like run away from. And I think some of the tensions that we've seen across these different groups is sort of how they navigate that reality, that sort of like dialectical relationship with like the structure and the system of capital always being right there. And, you know, like definitely the insiders being like, we can work with this, and this is like a way to get out of this. And then I think these outsiders and beyonders groups kind of like trying to trouble that. And like, that's sort of what we're seeing some of the tensions in, maybe looking at the different pieces of the framework, is maybe how they respond to the like instant capture almost of anything that's like put out there. So, I mean, that's not a great answer in terms of like giving you the explicit framework. I wish I could manifest.
Is there a geographic scale to what these groups, like, are some of them working only local or neighborhood level versus?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Yeah, so there is like in some of the beyonder stuff that we found anyways, like it's more localized, you know. And I remember I had this really great professor in like first year of my PhD where she was just like, no matter what anyone tells you, it all comes down to land. And just like where you exist, and your relationship to that. So what we've almost found is like the more maybe radical or anti-institutional, the more localized the movements seem to be, would be like one pattern that comes. And so like a lot of the insider stuff is thinking in terms of like global climate accords, and a lot of this is like, let's get some community gardens, so that would be like one tension that we see, right? It's almost like the more outside, the more it actually just tries to ground it in a materiality. So yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, other folks, any other questions? Yeah.
We got a comment from Zoom. Hila said, thank you for a great presentation on various ways to engage in collective action. I'm the environmental psychology researcher at UVic and wanted to add some evidence to the discussion about eco-anxiety and action paralysis. Our research and those of other colleagues has shown that eco-anxiety is significantly associated with engagement in pro-environmental behavior. It is possible that little anxiety is related to low concern and no action, and that too much anxiety and doom mentality is associated with a freeze response. So eco-anxiety can serve as an adaptive response rather than paralyzing, and is not mutually exclusive with hope, as evidenced amidst many activists.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I mean, I look at my research a lot around this tension of like high functioning anxiety and how it's like sort of celebrated because people get things done. Like it's not celebrated like by practitioners per se, but culturally. It's like, oh, like that's so great, you're so productive, like you're getting all these things done, right? As long as it achieves that desired like maximum output. And so I think that there is like a sweet spot where again, something like anxiety can be mobilizing and like an effective, useful tool to like drive action. But I think it can always also be paralyzing. And I think the distinction I would probably make is like, are you situating your anxiety like in connection with other people's anxiety and the larger structure, or are you sort of isolating that anxiety off, which is kind of the reaction that we often have. And then I think it's more like a kind of a paralyzing thing, But I would want to frame this all in this larger context of, I think, this tension between this like culture and language and discourse of like, we're so empowered, we're so connected, like we're living in this future, and then the material reality of that being that like, a banana now costs like $2. And so I think that paradox is really what's like so disorienting for people.
Okay. Okay, I think